Hi, folks. Welcome back to another session of Anatomy and Physiology with Ms. McFadden and Mrs. Stricker. Today we're going to talk about the integumentary system. Integument is also referred to as skin. And we don't think about skin very often in terms of it being an organ for our body, but it is. So some interesting facts about skin. First, it is the largest organ of our body, and depending on how tall you are or how big you are, it can cover up to about 21 square feet. If you were thinking about how much of your body is comprised of your skin's mass, it's somewhere between 7 and 15% of your total body weight, or around 9 pounds. And if you take a look at all of the things that one particular square inch of skin contains, there's quite a bit. So we've got blood vessels, hair, and hair muscles, which we'll talk about in a minute. 78 nerves, a lot of sensors for heat, 13 sensors for cold, and interesting that we have more sensors for heat than cold, 160 sensors for pressure, oil glands, 650 sweat glands in a square inch of skin, 1,300 nerve endings, over 19,500,000 cells, and we have about 500,000 cells being replaced and dying all the time. So when we think about our skin, we're talking about a really complex combination of tissues, and it's the only organ of our body that covers our whole body as a continuous layer. As you follow along with me, you can fill these things out in your notes as well. So make sure that you are adding the things that are not listed in there and making sure you get them in that notes document. Okay, so let's talk about the layers of our skin, or layers of our integumentary system. There are 3 layers that we're going to talk about, and we'll further discuss each of those layers in turn. But the outer layer of your skin, what we're touching constantly, is called the epidermis. It's made up of these cells called epithelial cells, and it is sort of our first layer of defense. So epidermis, epi meaning top, above, we talked about that before. Dermis is the next layer of our skin, and this layer of our skin is a little bit different than the epidermis. It's really tough. So it's going to be really tough and leathery. It's kind of this fibrous connective tissue, and it's the only part of our integument that's vascularized or has veins leading to it. Our epidermis doesn't have veins in it. So anytime you cut yourself and you bleed, you've cut through the epidermis down to that dermis section. And sometimes we call this dermis the corium, but we will probably in this class always call it the dermis. So just to clarify. And then below that dermis, sometimes we call this the hypodermis. And remember, hypo means below, or subcutaneous. And sub also means below. So this is our deepest layer of our integumentary system. It's really not our skin anymore. It's made up of a variety of different tissues, but we have adipose tissue there for fat storage, and we also have this areolar connective tissue. That's going to help anchor our skin to the underlying muscles that are beneath our skin. And I know that this is going to be kind of gross for you to think about, but if you've ever done cooking in the kitchen and you've taken, let's say, a chicken, and you've decided to skin the chicken, when you pull that skin off of the chicken and you leave just the muscle or the meat below, what you're taking off are both the epidermis and the dermal layer of the skin. And then as you kind of tear that apart, when we're getting to the subcutaneous layer, it's this fibrous connective tissue that makes it kind of hard to pull the skin off. That's our hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. That subcutaneous layer is where our fat is stored. It's going to allow our skin to kind of slide freely across our muscle tissues. It's going to help insulate our bodies for when we're cold or when we need to protect our organs and our internal important parts. And as we gain weight, our subcutaneous layer is the layer that actually gets bigger. It gets thicker over time. And there are some pictures down here of the different layers. You can see the epidermis here. And like I said before, the epidermis is a fairly thin layer of your skin. There are parts of your body where your epidermis is thicker. So the bottoms of your feet, for example, may have a thicker epidermis than other areas. The top of your skull has a really thin epidermis. There's not a lot of skin covering up there, and that epidermis layer is really thin. So it's not the same thickness throughout your body. The dermis is that middle layer that we talked about. And remember, this is the layer of your skin that's going to have the veins and the vascularization that we talked about. And it's going to be kind of tough and leathery. And then when we get underneath that to the subcutaneous layer, that's where we start having these adipose stores or these fat stores underneath. And we'll talk about some of these other things that you can see here in this skin image in just a second. One of the things that you're going to need to know are the 3 layers of the skin and sort of some of their functions as we're working through this. So keep that in mind. I would put stars in your notes next to all 3 of those, epidermis, dermis, and either hypodermis or subcutaneous. Okay, so what are the functions of our skin? First and foremost, it's our primary layer of protection. So it's going to protect us against microbes, dirt, chemicals. It'll help absorb some shock. So, when you're jumping up and down and the pressure of that is running through your body, your skin is helping cushion that shock. It also helps with water balance. Our skin is both going to help prevent losing water, and also it's going to help absorb water. So that water balance is going to be really important. We use our skin to help regulate our temperature. We talked about how the blood vessels can either get thicker, right? They can dilate, or they can constrict and get smaller when we're cold. We use our skin to help get rid of waste. So we can excrete oils and water. We excrete sodium through our skin, carbon dioxide. All of these things can be transferred through that organ. And then also we use our skin to help us get messages from our environment. So we have all kinds of receptor signals that are sensed by our skin. And that can include things like touch and pleasure, pain, heat, cold, pressure. All of those things can be felt through our skin. And the last important thing that our skin does is it helps our bodies produce an essential vitamin called vitamin D. And we'll talk a little bit more about vitamin D as we work through this unit, but that vitamin D aids in the absorption of calcium, which you all know is one of the things that makes our bones strong. And that's going to be important as we talk about aging and how to take care of our bodies, for sure. Okay, so remember we talked about the 3 layers. So we have the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous. So we're going to talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. The epidermis is, like I said before, the outer layer. It does not have any blood vessels. And anytime you see this A in front of a word, it means without. So without vascularization. Our epidermis is continually replacing itself. These are some of the fastest dividing cells, and we get new skin or new cells about every 35 days. And we talked about how the thickness and thinness of epidermis can vary. The epidermis itself can be broken down into a couple of layers. There's 4 of them, but we're only going to talk about 2 of them for this class. The first one we're going to talk about is called the stratum corneum. And this is the outermost layer of our epidermis. It's made of dead protein. And these proteins fill up our cells and help us with water balance. So it's kind of like our waterproofing, that outermost layer, the stratum corneum. And then the deepest layer is called the stratum germativum or basal layer. And I will always use this word, which is why I can't pronounce this word. That stratum basal layer is our deepest layer of the epidermis. And what happens in that layer is that those cells divide and replace those dead protein-filled cells on top, and those just get sloughed off. That basal layer is just a single layer of skin cells, and they're mostly stem cells. That layer is what's going to help determine your skin color. So the amount of melanin that's found in that stratum basal layer is going to help determine if you're really pale skinned or if you're darker skinned. And the more melanin you have in that layer, the darker your skin is. And this layer, the stratum basal layer, is what connects your dermis with some connective tissue. And we've kind of talked about that already. As a side note, remember I talked about this superficial layer of dead protein-filled cells. One of the reasons it's important to wash your sheets is because your skin is sloughing off those dead skin cells all the time. If you don't wash your sheets are literally filled with these layers of dead skin cells that keep regenerating. Like I said, your epidermis is going to replace itself fully every 35 days. So that's a lot. I don't know how to delete this without doing this. That's something I need to figure out, so apologies. Okay, so we talked about the epidermis and some of the layers of the epidermis. I have a picture for you. It's kind of hard to understand, but I'll walk you through it a little bit. If you take a look at the next slide, this is a picture of the epidermis of a mammal, and the only two layers that we really care about, remember, are this first layer, that very top layer, the dead layer of cells, and then this bottom layer that connects to the dermis. So if I were to ask you, what layer of the epidermis connects to the dermis, you could say the stratum basal layer. Remember, that's the same. It's a synonym here. Or the stratum germinativum would also work there. So either of those answers would be correct. And that's just a cross section of some mammalian skin. All right. So we've talked about the epidermis. Now we're going to talk about the dermis. The dermis is what we call the true skin of our bodies. Instead of being made of kind of dead cells and those cells that are regenerating, this layer of our skin is really strong and really flexible connective tissue. One of the questions that we get year after year is, how does your skin wrinkle? And the dermis, which is what is flexible in your skin, over time will lose its elastin and fat as we age, and that's what makes your skin actually start to wrinkle. And so when we get older, like Ms. McFadden, you start to lose your skin's ability to have that elastin that kind of pulls it tight. In the dermis, we have blood vessels, so make sure you put a star next to that. That's pretty important. We have some lymphatic vessels. We also have nerves, and then that's where our hair shafts and hair follicles are going to originate. And we also have some of those sensory receptors that we talked about. So just like the epidermis had a couple layers that we talked about, the dermis has a couple layers we need to talk about as well. And we're going to talk about two layers of the dermis. The first layer is called the papillary layer. This is the real connective tissue of your dermis, and that's where lots of blood vessels are. So when you cut through your skin and you start to bleed, you have cut through to that papillary layer where those blood vessels are. We also have pain receptors there. We're going to have touch receptors. And this area, the papillary layer, is what creates our fingerprints. All along our papillary layer, there are these things called dermal ridges that kind of bump up and down like this, found on the palms and the soles of our feet. They're there to help us with gripping and creating friction so we can grab on and hold on to things. And they are what produce our fingerprints. So the papillary layer is where our fingerprints come from. And it's these dermal ridges in the papillary layer that show all those coils and swirls that we see in fingerprints. The next layer, which is called the reticular layer, is a little bit deeper. And this is where we have that elasticity that I was talking about that we lose as we age. And the reticular layer is made of collagen. It's there for some elasticity. And it keeps your skin strong and resilient and hydrated. And one of the things that you can see as you age like Ms. McFadden and you're starting to look for things that help maybe prevent your wrinkles, are lotions. And a lot of these lotions will have collagen in them, with the advertising claim that that collagen in the lotions will help keep your reticular layer, um, have lots of available collagen to keep your skin tight and resilient. So a couple of things can happen in your skin that I think are interesting. The first is stretch marks. And if you don't have any yet, likely you will get some. It's really common for women to get stretch marks when they're pregnant because they have an extreme amount of growth. But also, men or adolescent boys will get stretch marks across their chest as their muscles get bigger when they start producing excess testosterone, and they might get them across their abdomen sometimes as they get bigger and wider, and girls will sometimes get them across their hips as well when they hit puberty and start kind of getting an hourglass shape. But stretch marks happen because our dermis stretches so much that it actually tears, and that leads to those stretch marks. And there are some things you can do to kind of make those better, but those don't really go away. They don't ever go away. You kind of always have these tiny scars from that tearing. The other thing that's interesting about the dermis is that this is where blisters form. So when you have a lot of friction in your skin, your epidermis and your dermis kind of rub back and forth against one another, and your body will release fluid to create a pocket in there to kind of protect that rubbing from damaging your dermis, and that's what forms a blister. So when you pop a blister, you're actually preventing your body from protecting your dermis from being harmed from that friction. So maybe a good idea to let those heal on their own, although it can be tempting, I know. Okay, and here's a picture of the dermis. So we're underneath the epidermis, right? And we're at the dermis now. And if you take a look at these kind of wavy portions of the dermis, this is what forms your fingerprints. These ridges are what going to form your fingerprints on the soles and palms of your hands. And then that deeper reticular layer is below that. Oops, wrong tool, Miss McFadden. Okay, we're close. You're doing a great job. So what other things are there in our skin that we need to talk about? The other things that are included in our skin are these accessory organs, or these extra things that we include in our integumentary system. And one is our nails. Our fingernails and our toenails are made of these dead epidermal cells that have been keratinized. They get harder. And those dead epidermal cells grow underneath what's called a lanula, which is the white portion of your nail bed. And if you take a look at your fingernails and you see that moon structure that kind of, I can try to show you yours. Mine, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a little moon shape there. That's where your nails grow from. And that those dead keratinized epidermal cells push their way out, and they are a form of protection, but they're part of our integumentary system. If you damage your lanula, it will actually damage how your nail grows out. And you can see that sometimes your parents will have funny looking fingernails, and that's because they've damaged the origin of where those cells come from. Not only do we have nails, we also have hair, right? And we have hair all over our body, whether you have a lot or a little. You know, we're all mammals, so we all have hair. And the hair has both a follicle and a shaft. And at the base of all those hair follicles, there are these little tiny muscles called erector pili muscles, and they're pretty important. They're the muscles that make your hair stand up. So when you're cold and you start to shiver, those erector pili muscles contract and pull your hair up. And that, in doing so, helps to try to insulate your body, and also will start stimulating a shiver response too, right? A lot of times we get goosebumps and the hair muscles come up and we start shivering to help produce some heat. We also have some glands that are found in our skin. These are funny words, so do the best that you can. I will ask you about this one on your quiz over skin. Our sweat glands are called sudoriferous glands, and there are two kinds. The eccrine glands are just ordinary sweat glands, and the apocrine glands are these really large glands in the stinky places of our body. And these are what produce what are called pheromones. So apocrine glands are going to produce our smelly sweat, and There's all this theory about how pheromones are produced and what they do for us, but we know that those smelly glands are called apocrine glands, and they will often release hormones inside those sweat glands to maybe stimulate attraction. And I know that that's hard to think about, but mammals are sort of designed to like the way each other smells. There's an experiment that was done on pheromones that's kind of interesting. They took women who were ovulating and they took sweat wipes from under their armpits and around their genital areas, all their apocrine gland areas, and they put these sweat soaked pads beneath movie theater seats in a movie theater and had men come in and pick a seat to watch a movie. And the men picked seats that had these sweat soaked pheromone pads beneath them, suggesting that, you know, men subconsciously are attracted to the pheromones that women release when they ovulate, which is kind of cool, but also we don't like thinking about it. So sudoriferous are sweat glands. And then we also have oil glands that are called sebaceous glands, and that's going to be on your test as well. So make sure you know that one. What happens with sebaceous glands or these oil glands is that we release an oil called sebum that works as a lubricant to help with a hair follicle and keep that hair follicle lubricated and open so the hair can grow out and stand up when it needs to, and so on. If you have a plugged sebaceous gland, you get a blackhead. And then if you have a bacterial infected sebaceous gland, that's when you get a pimple or a zit. So keeping those glands clear is helpful just in, you know, maintaining healthy skin. And we also have earwax glands that produce wax inside our ears to help keep our ears protected from things coming in from our external environment into our bodies. So lots and lots of important things for sure in our skin, and lots of different things that are help designed to keep us, to keep us safer. Okay, one thing that I want you to do is take a minute and actually draw a picture of your skin cross section, and the things I need you to include. You need to make sure you have epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous layer, or hypodermis, right? That's the same thing. This muscle right here, the erector pili muscle, is important, and you can see as it contracts, it's going to pull, and it's going to pull that hair up. You should also have hair follicle labeled. That's the bottom of the hair. This is actually the hair shaft. So remember we talked about there's a follicle and a shaft. This part is the shaft. That's the part that protrudes from your skin. Notice that sebaceous glands are for the hair follicle to come out of your skin. So this oil gland needs to be connected to a hair follicle. That's pretty important. Then we also have a sweat gland. That's this here. It's called a sudoriferous gland, remember. Blood vessels are only found in the dermis. And then these things right here that look like tree branches, these are nerve endings. And those nerves are found underneath the epidermis, kind of in the top dermal layer, and so on. So if you would take a minute and make sure that you include those things in your drawing, because you'll need them on a test. If I gave you a blank picture of a skin cross-section and I asked you to label things, I would expect you to be able to label those things on your picture. When you're finished with your notes, remember you should be filling out your corresponding note packet. Also make sure you answer the Ed Puzzle questions as you go, and hopefully I'll see you in class soon. Bye, folks.